Hello, this is Gustav Durrell with Customized Energy Solutions. Today we're going to speak about COP26 for the last week plus and what it means for the energy professional. So far there have been two major themes coming out of the media and our understanding of the meetings. The first major theme is that we have major industrialized countries such as US, Canada, EU, and Japan, who are all making major commitments to fighting climate change, even in excess of previous commitments just prior to COP. So there have been some very positive surprises. Most people are considering this a great success, as these commitments, or pledges as they're called, represent significant movement towards keeping the world to within 1.5 degrees Celsius of pre-industrialized times. At the same time, we have protesters who are outside, mostly young people, protesting what is going on inside as a PR stunt, as failing the countries that they represent, and as failing the young people of the world. Many commentators are looking at both these messages and saying they're both true, and that it's difficult to reconcile. Consider the pledges by themselves. Pledges without follow-through at their respective parliaments or democracies or congresses will represent increased risk for investment in current technologies and ultimately will lead to energy shocks. Energy shocks in terms of prices and shortages in supply. And that's what we're seeing today in the United States with escalating energy prices, around the world with escalating gas prices, and in China in particular with shortages of energy requiring them to increase their production of coal-fired generation. This is a result of poor planning around the necessary certainty of demand for renewables to fulfill the gap from lack of investment in current technologies. Protesters are observing that the lack of certainty for demand in renewable energy is occurring, and as such are considering the leaders as having failed the world and the young people themselves. And yet these leaders are earnest. They're working very hard towards moving towards a zero emission pledges that they would like to have by 2050. And yet, so far, these pledges are mostly non-binding. In democracies, they require the support of Congresses, like in the United States, and this is difficult to achieve. So protesters should be focusing their efforts on those elements that are resisting change. Okay, so let's consider the pledges that were represented in COP26 in a little bit more detail. India came out with the most significant pledge to be net zero by 2070. Most people believe this is representing CO2 emissions and not other greenhouse warming gases. Also, India represented a commitment to have 500 gigawatts of non-fossil fuel generation by 2030, 50% of which is renewable. Very significant commitments in terms of their growth in renewable technologies and portfolio. 46 countries have made commitments around coal to end coal generation and support for it as a fuel for energy generation. Unfortunately, this did not include China, the US, India, or Australia, which represent 4 of the 5 largest energy producers through coal in the world and 90% of all the energy generation by coal. So although this is a significant movement in the right direction by 46 countries, it unfortunately did not represent the leaders. US has pledged prior to COP26 and recommitted to COP26 its Build Back Better plan through Joe Biden, President of the United States, and its $1.2 trillion package that recently passed Congress. As we look to the $1.2 trillion package and delve into the details, we see a $65 billion commitment for power infrastructure, which represents new transmission lines to support additional wind generation. There's been an additional $7.5 billion for EV charging stations, which represent about 7% of the necessary EV charging stations, and $7.5 billion for school buses, which represents about 7% of school buses in the United States. Again, these are relatively small commitments for what's necessary to transition our energy infrastructure and energy markets to the new reality represented by climate change imperatives. The Build Back Better plan represents consumer rebates and tax incentives and tax credits to shift to a clean energy and EVs. And again, the details are not clear here, but they do not represent firm demand commitments on the renewable side. U.S. made clean energy tech as part of the Build Back Better plan, which will be difficult to transition to as many of the parts represented by the renewable energy sector today are imported. There's a commitment to focus on disadvantaged communities as well in the Build Back Better plan. That's the US. There is also a non-binding commitment by a number of countries to protect forests and end deforestation. There was quite a few countries that signed up to this commitment, and 85% of the forests in the world are represented by Brazil, Russia, and China, and so we need their participation in this commitment. And another big commitment was to cut methane emissions by 30% by 2030. But again, unfortunately, this did not include China, Russia, and India, which represent the preponderance of methane emissions. Methane emissions come from oil and gas operations, livestock, and landfills. Finally, Russia and China's leaders did not show up at COP26, and this doesn't bode well since no worldwide climate policies can be successful to fight climate change at a world level without the support and participation and follow-through of China and Russia. So let us consider what is necessary to achieve climate goal targets. Under current policies and legislation at respective major industrialized countries, we know, based on economics of available supply, that global warming is likely to increase on average 2.6 to 2.7 degrees from pre-industrialized times, and this represents a catastrophic climate change result, far from the target of 1.5 degrees. We already have 1.1 degrees built into the atmosphere from previous CO2 emissions and methane emissions, so we don't have a long ways to go to achieve the 1.5 degree target, which is the problem. We need to be aggressive and we need to be moved quickly in order to achieve the target of minimizing climate change to 1.5 degrees. There are various policies and initiatives each country can achieve as a result of these non-binding pledges or as a follow-through. There are three categories. Market forces basically set demand, they establish supply, and ultimately they establish the cost or the price for that supply. In the past, we've had feed-in tariffs in Europe and in Japan for renewable technologies focused on wind and solar. And those feed-in tariffs ultimately set the demand and set the price. The supply was established based on the technology, and this actually achieved its goal. The feed-in tariffs achieved huge increases in the available portfolio of renewable technology at a very significant cost to the countries that participated. We owe a grand debt to those countries because they began the virtuous cycle of achieving scale, which ultimately began the continuous lowering of costs associated with renewable technologies. Since that time, most countries have realized that feed-in tariffs is one of the most costly ways to accelerate the growth of renewable technologies. Another set of policies, which we set demand, but we let capitalist market forces to establish the lowest cost supply and ultimately the price. Policies such as renewable portfolio standards with penalties for failure to meet those standards, or emissions standards restricting portfolios to meet emission standards with penalties for failure to meet emission standards, such as in the EU. At the EV or vehicle level, we have vehicle manufacturers' requirements to achieve a certain percentage of sales of ZEVs, such as in California, which is the only state that has instituted this at this level. And in the EU, we have vehicle portfolio CO2 emission standards or targets with penalties for failure to meet those targets. In every one of these cases, demand is set by government or by policy, and capitalist forces ultimately set the supply and the price. This is instituted through either utility RFPs or government RFPs, and is also supported through public and international financing in developing country projects. Those are very effective ways to accelerate the growth of renewables and clean technologies. Another set of policies do not set the demand by any particular policy, but seek to lower the cost of supply and ultimately let market prices set price, such as low-cost loans or financing for projects which ultimately seek a return on investment, but make the available monies to particular types of projects, such as clean energy technologies. Preferred installation rules, rebates, tax incentives, HOV lane access for EVs, car chargers everywhere as a result of rebates for EV charging. All of these represent technologies that can be supported through government, but do not set demand and will accelerate the availability of renewable technologies and clean technologies, but have no way of assuring that we'll achieve the targets in establishing the volume necessary for clean climate requirements. In summary, the young people are right. COP26 by no means will solve the problems that are necessary to address climate change. And yet, COP26 is a huge success so far, in that it provides us a clear path of what is necessary to achieve the goals. It moves us in the direction we need to move, and it has established a new standard in terms of pledges. We know what we need to do. We know that we need to increase our pledges. We know that we need to include all the major countries. We need to include the US, Canada, European Union countries. We need to include Russia, Japan, China, India, Brazil. And without any one of them, we can fail from achieving our goals. So we have to come together. We know what kind of legislation or policies need to be set in place. We know that we need to set demand and let market forces establish the best, lowest cost supply so that we can keep our resolve. We know that the technologies mostly exist, at least for the next 10 to 20 years as we go in this path. All the available technology exists today. There's nothing stopping us from achieving the goals that the young people are protesting about in the streets, except our resolve, our ability to work together, and our willingness to make the necessary sacrifices and investments to address climate change as one of the most important issues of our time. It's up to us. We can bring together everybody to make this work, and we need to work together to achieve this goal.